A crow is lying on the sidewalk, dead, hit by a car, or just stopped, the way things sometimes do. Within minutes, another crow lands nearby. Then another. Then 5 more arrive from different directions, dropping in from rooftops and telephone wires and trees you didn't know were occupied. They form a loose ring around the body. Nobody moves, nobody eats, nobody calls. They stand there, in something that looks uncomfortably close to stillness, and they watch. This isn't a rescue attempt. The bird is gone. They know that. This is something else entirely. Scientists call it a crow funeral, and here's the part that should unsettle you. After decades of research, cameras, controlled field experiments, and peer-reviewed papers, nobody has fully agreed on why it happens. The first person to study this systematically wasn't looking for funerals. Kaylee Swift, a researcher at the University of Washington, was mapping crow behavior, and when she noticed something strange buried in the field data. Crows weren't just avoiding places where they'd encountered predators. They were avoiding places where they'd seen dead crows, sometimes for weeks afterward. The death of a single bird was quietly reshaping the movement patterns of an entire local population. That raised an obvious question. What exactly were they picking up on? Was it the body itself? The location? The specific circumstances of the death? To find out, Swift designed one of the stranger experiments in modern ornithology. She trained volunteers to wear latex masks, some neutral, some designed to look threatening, and walk through areas with established crow populations. One group of volunteers wore the masks while carrying a dead crow. Others wore identical masks while carrying nothing. The crows' responses were immediate and dramatically different. The ones who witnessed someone near a dead crow didn't just avoid that masked person afterward. They mobbed them. Alarm calls, wing strikes, dive bombing at close range. And they recruited other crows, birds that hadn't even been present during the original scene, by calling them in from surrounding rooftops. But here's what made the experiment genuinely strange. It didn't stop there. Weeks later, the same masked face would appear in the same neighborhood. No dead crow, no threat in sight. And the response came back immediately. The crows hadn't forgotten. They had filed the face, stored the association, and were still carrying it months later. One crow in Swift's study recognized a threatening mask it hadn't seen in over a year. It started alarm calling before the person was even close. So the gathering around a dead crow isn't passive mourning. It's active, it's investigative. The crows are scanning the scene, cataloging the threat, and distributing that information through the local network. The death becomes a data point. The location becomes a flagged coordinate. The face of anyone nearby becomes a stored threat. But here's what the risk assessment theory doesn't fully account for. The silence. When a crow spots a hawk, it screams. When another crow steals its food, it screams. When something moves through its territory that doesn't belong there, it screams. Crows are among the loudest, most aggressive birds in the urban ecosystem. Noise is their primary defensive tool, so watch what happens when a crow dies near an active predator. A hawk circling overhead, a cat crouching in nearby grass. The gathering crows erupt, they mob, they alarm call at full volume, coordinating in real time, driving the threat away with collective noise. Now watch what happens when a crow dies alone. No predator, no visible threat, just a body on the ground. The crows that arrive go quiet. They land softly, without the usual aggression of landing near competitors. They don't spread out to forage. They position themselves around the body, and they stop. The silence isn't incidental. It's a shift in behavioral mode. The same birds that were screaming at a squirrel 20 minutes earlier are now completely still. That gap between the two responses, screaming chaos versus collective silence, is what keeps pulling researchers back. Risk assessment predicts, gather, scan, extract information, leave. It doesn't predict that the gathering would look like this. If the silence is what got you, give the video a like, because it gets harder to explain from here. There's a street in Seattle that crows started avoiding after a crow died there, not just the day of the death, for weeks. Residents noticed the birds rerouting their morning flights, taking longer paths around the block, landing on opposite rooftops when before they'd perched directly above that stretch of pavement. No predator had been seen there. No human had done anything threatening. One crow had died, others had gathered, and something about the location had been quietly marked as dangerous in the collective memory of the local population. That's the part that's hard to explain mechanically, because avoiding a place for weeks requires storing not just the threat, but the location, the duration of the avoidance, and some ongoing calculation about when it becomes safe again. That's not a reflex. That's something much closer to geography-based memory, a map of the neighborhood annotated with warnings. Now consider what crows are doing cognitively to pull this off. They recognize individual human faces, not just mask types, but specific faces, at specific distances, in changing light conditions. Research has shown that crows who had a negative experience with one person will respond differently to that person's face months later. While ignoring people who were standing nearby during the same event, they're not tracking humans as a category. They're tracking individuals. They plan ahead. They hide food in locations they'll return to hours or days later based on predicted hunger. If another crow is watching when they hide food, they'll return later, when the observer is gone, and move it to a different location. That requires modeling another animal's knowledge state, understanding that the other crow knows something, and acting to correct for it. They teach. Techniques for cracking specific types of food containers have been documented spreading through crow populations the way a skill spreads through a community. One bird watches, tries, succeeds, and younger birds adopt the method. So when a crow stands over a dead companion and doesn't move, doesn't eat, doesn't call, the simplest explanation may genuinely not be the right one. Risk assessment is real. It's documented. It's measurable. But it may be one layer of a behavior that has more layers than we've managed to peel back yet. There's a crow in a video filmed in someone's backyard in the Pacific Northwest. A young crow, probably a juvenile, dead in the grass. An older bird, presumably a parent based on the behavioral pattern, lands beside it and stays. No alarm call, no food investigation. The older bird nudges the body once with its beak, then pulls back. It turns its head slightly, the way animals do when something doesn't process correctly. Then it just remains there, in the grass, beside a bird it clearly knew. It stays for 11 minutes before leaving. 11 minutes is a long time to hold still when you're an animal whose survival depends on constant environmental scanning. Every second of stillness is a second of reduced threat detection. Whatever that crow was doing, it was worth the metabolic and survival cost. The behavioral shift, the silence, the proximity, the duration, keeps producing the same conceptual problem for researchers. We don't have a framework for crow inner life that doesn't either collapse into pure mechanism or overclaim toward human-like consciousness. The categories we use were built for humans, extended awkwardly to other primates, and don't fit cleanly over a bird that grieves on a sidewalk in a city it's shared with us for centuries. That line between animals with inner lives and animals without them has been redrawn before. Primates forced a redraw. Then elephants, who return to the bones of their dead and have been filmed standing silently over the remains of family members, running their trunks across skulls and tusks. Then cetaceans, dolphins and whales that carry dead calves for days, that show measurable behavioral changes after the deaths of pod members. Each time the evidence arrived, the line moved. Crows are making the same kind of argument, not with language, with behavior that accumulates into something that is very difficult to dismiss. What's strange is how long this has been happening in plain sight. Crows live in our cities. They nest in our trees, eat from our streets, watch us from wires every single morning. They've been adapting to human environments for thousands of years, close enough to study us in detail, close enough to have developed what researchers now believe is a nuanced model of how humans behave and what we're likely to do next. And the whole time, they've been holding funerals. Not in forests, not in protected wilderness, in parking lots, in suburban backyards, on sidewalks outside coffee shops, while someone inside is ordering a drink and not looking up. Think about how many times you've walked past a crow and assumed it was just being a crow, present in that uncomplicated animal way, waiting, watching. It might have been doing something far more complicated than anything you did that day. Science will keep narrowing in. The experiments will become more precise. The imaging technology will improve. Eventually, there will be a cleaner answer about what's pure mechanism, what's social learning, and what, if anything, occupies a third category we don't have a clean word for yet. But right now, in this moment, the most honest thing the research can offer is this. When a crow dies, others gather. They go quiet. They stay longer than any purely functional model fully predicts. And when they leave, the place they leave behind is different, marked, remembered, carried forward in some form we're still trying to understand. Whether that's grief, or something older than grief, or something that arrived at the same destination by a completely different route, that's still the question. And the fact that it's still the question, after all the research, all the cameras, all the carefully designed experiments, that might be the most interesting thing about it. If this kind of story is why you watch, the ones where science reaches a real edge and just stands there, subscribe. There are more of them coming.